Hello, class. This is part 2 of this chapter 4 material on experimental and observational studies. So we had left off after completing this involving the sampling techniques, and I want to continue after this particular point. So let me scroll us down under after that. Well, we had just done this sampling types and whatnot. So that particular portion though dealt with the sampling techniques themselves. So while it is nice to have a technique in mind when actually trying to conduct a statistical analysis, um, you also need to actually have a way to actually sample the people after you find people to sample, right? And I have three potential options here. A personal interview or a face-to-face interview could also be um, like where you talk to someone and ask them a bunch of questions and record answers. A telephone interview, this uses something called a random digit dialing. It dials without a frame. A frame is just a listing of everyone in the population. So, or in this case, a frame involving this would be a frame of all telephone numbers. So the frame is a list of everyone in the population. The dials without the frame, randomly choosing an area code and a three-digit exchange. The last four digits dialed would be dialed randomly. Problem though is, despite the way that this is actually worded and whatnot, this is not random. Despite the fact that the word random is utilized inside of it multiple times, it's still not a particularly random occurrence, and not everyone is counted equally to be chosen for this. And a self-administered questionnaire, fewer participants, and you tend to start having that volunteerism or convenience-based sample. Also, could be something that you do online too, for that matter. Bias in sampling. Sampling bias results from the sampling method used. So, what that tends to indicate would be something referred to as undercoverage. The frame lacks representation of the population. So like for example, a good one is the a good one involved that would be something such as the stratified sampling, where it's supposed to be based on those proportions. But if your proportions don't match the proportions in the population, then you're under coverage or over count. You're either undercounting a certain portion of that population, or overcounting a certain portion of that population. This is if the proportions don't match the sample. For example, second one is a non-response bias. This being some sampled subjects do not answer. They can't be reached. They refuse to answer. They hang up the phone if you dial them. They click delete on the email with the survey on it. They just don't engage with it. Every sampling technique suffers from some form of this. I should probably make note due to the fact that every single one does suffer from it. So, like for example, the end of the semester surveys, right? Not everyone completes those. How much is too much in that regard, right? With regard to the non-sampling bias, I should probably make a very big caveat here that if we are referring to a non-sampling bias, it needs to be a pretty big margin, a pretty small number of people that actually answered the survey. So for this class, this would be some very small number that answered. depending, of course, but that's what that's in reference to. Third one is response bias. Response bias, well, depends on what we're referencing, but it's a bias in the response of what was collected. That could refer to an interviewer error or preferred answer, meaning you, the interviewer, did not ask questions in a certain format or balancing them in that type of regard. The preferred answer one refers more so to where the respondent answers in a way that benefits what the interviewer already thinks, as opposed to what the responder actually thinks. That's where that comes from. Could also come from lying, wording of the questions, order of the questions or answers, meaning are they asked in a balanced format? Meaning, do you favor or oppose? For example, raising the minimum tax. Not just do you favor raising the minimum tax. Ordering of questions. That refers to something where the questions, if you ask a bunch of questions, you you scatter the types of questions around, as in don't just ask like 10 questions about minimum wage, one right after the other. Also refers, well, the next one refers to this part. The answers, like for example, if you're doing a satisfaction survey and every single question's rate in a scale from 1 to 5, you can just go right down the list, choosing a number with absolutely no thought process whatsoever. So the ordering of the questions is to space out the types of questions that you are using, and the answer-based ones are where you ask the same type of question, and you could just go right down the list. I should say not same type of question, same type of answer choices, like in satisfaction surveys. When you're on a scale from 1 to 5, how satisfied are you with today's product? And they go from 1 to 5, and you just go right down the list with like all threes or something, right? And then they always say that only highly satisfied counts for this. And if you choose anything that's not highly satisfied, all of a sudden it's a bad thing. That type of thing. Type of question, while not necessarily bias worthy, where it's easy to identify, but it's more like a caution type of thing involving what you're doing. So like an open question versus a closed question. An open question, there's a loss of greater variability. It's harder to analyze. It's open in the sense that you write in a response. So since the responder gets to write what they think, it tends to be more. It tends to be more so where they get to speak their mind, as opposed to trying to fit into a predefined sense. But because they could actually speak their mind, it's a bit harder to analyze what is going on. And you're like, for example, you can't do a highly satisfied survey in that sense, because people could say, bits and pieces like, "Oh yes, I'm highly satisfied with this, but this happened." That type of thing, which means that it's not really highly satisfied. Versus a closed question, there's a predefined answers. It's easier to analyze because you have a predefined ones you can actually choose from. But it may not reflect true feelings of the respondents. So this is like, for example, like a multiple choice thing. I can choose from a scale 1 to 5 how highly satisfied you are, that type of thing. I like to use the example of this one time when I gave a survey in a course and I asked about what state are you from? Right? And when I asked that, one method of doing that would be, oh yeah, I could just put in, for example, states in the Northeast. into like an answer choice box. And then people could just choose from those options. Which that would be a closed type of question if I did that, because you're predefined to choosing ones in there. But what happens if you're not from that particular state, right? So I made it open. And the problem with the open type of question then is that I got 5 different misspellings of the state of New York from that. So while it can be helpful, sometimes you might have to go back in and actually fix mistakes. Like in that regard of, you know, when you have so many misspellings of the same state, it sounds like a different state, but it's really the same. So kind of depends, unfortunately. This fourth example here. Based on these scenarios, I want to determine the type of bias present and what can be done to actually remedy it. A retail store manager wants to conduct a study regarding the shopping habits of his customers. He selects the first 60 who enter his store on a Saturday morning. This is an example of a sampling bias. Why is that a sampling bias? It's the first 60 on a Saturday morning. Well, you don't know the time frame, actually. But if you're one of the first people into the store, you usually have a reason why you're going there. And you probably already like the store. Or at least enough about what they sell to know that you probably would like what they have in the store. In terms of the remedy for this would be asking at different days and times. There's no other problem with asking on a Saturday morning is also when people have more time to actually come, or the type of people might be a different clientele that particular day. You don't know. Suppose that you're conducting a survey regarding the sleeping habits of students. From a list of registered students, you obtain a simple random sample of 150 students. One survey question is, how much sleep do you get? Per that question specifically, this is a response bias. What's wrong with that question, you may ask? What is wrong with it is, what does that mean? How much sleep do you get? Are they referencing minutes, seconds, hours, days, weeks, an average amount? You don't know. Does not say. Is it going to be like the highest amount of sleep that you got the entire semester? Maybe. Who's to say? Um, to fix this, you would use some type of quantifier for that unit of measurement. And you might want to suggest an average. The amount of sleep that you get per night probably going to differ based upon the night. And especially if like, for example, with regard to school, if you are studying for a test, for example, you might not necessarily get the complete number of hours that you get when you have nothing going on. A polling organization conducts a study to estimate the percentage of households that speaks a foreign language as the primary language. It mails a questionnaire to 1,023 randomly selected households throughout the United States and asks the head of household if a foreign language is the primary language spoken in the home. Of the 1,023 households selected, only 12 responded. This is non-response bias. And the reason for that is the 12 responded out of 1,023. That's a pretty large gap that did not answer. So one way to fix this is send it again. Or one semester, a student gave this other suggestion, and I actually thought it was actually a pretty good suggestion for this too. So much so I'll make note of it here. Since this was about the foreign language being a primary language spoken in the home, if only 12 people responded, may potentially, at least a portion of them, might actually speak a foreign language and not be able to read the survey that was sent. So you could, for example, send it in different language. Is If someone in the household can't translate, they wouldn't be able to answer it, which would not be good at all. So, experiments, experimental parts, experimental units. These are subjects in experiment. Placebo looks, smells, and tastes like a drug with no active ingredient. And when you have a placebo, it is used with the control group. Placebo effect is when people who take a placebo respond better than those who receive nothing. Meaning that if you were testing like a drug or something, it is better to give something, even if it does nothing. So in that way, they don't, for example, change their habits. If they know what type of treatment they are actually receiving. So, for experiments, we can use randomization. Or I shouldn't say can. We definitely should be using randomization in it. This randomly assigned subject to treatment groups. It could attempt to balance treatment groups to reduce bias, and it keeps in mind variables that could impact the response rate. So, example number 5. I have here to investigate, whether antidepressants help people quit smoking. One study used 429 men and women who were 18 years of age or older and had smoked 15 cigarettes or more per day for the previous year. The subjects were highly motivated to quit and in good health. They were assigned to one of two groups. One group took 300 milligrams daily of the antidepressant with the name brand bupropion. The other group did not take the antidepressant. At the end of the year, a study was observed whether each subject had successfully abstained from smoking or had relapsed. We want the response and explanatory variables, the treatments, and the experimental units. So, explanatory variable. Whether or not they received the drug. The response variable. Would be whether or not you're abstaining from smoking. Whether you abstained from smoking. There we go. The treatments. This would be that 30 milligrams of antidepressant. Or apparently nothing. It makes no mention if a placebo is actually used. So because of that, I'm not going to write that down. And the subjects are going to be the 429 men and women. Who were 18 years of age or older and smoked 15 cigarettes or more per day for the previous year. So, observational studies. We could have what's referred to as a retrospective study versus a prospective study. Observational study specifically. Retrospective study. This looks at the past. So either past behavior, your past behavior, or information collected in the past. Versus a prospective study. Prospective are ones that it's in the future type of thing. But they, for example, watch you in the future. That type of thing because something happens or does not happen. So I have 3 types here. Case control observational study is a retrospective observational study where the subjects having a response variable of interest, called the cases, and subjects having the other response outcome of interest, controls, are compared. A cross-sectional study. is a sample survey of a population at the current time. So absolutely, it's not looking in the past, not looking in the future. It's at this present moment. And a cohort study, which is a prospective study. It identifies a group, this cohort, and observes them in the future. And it tends to last for a long time. I'll try putting quotation marks because long is relative. Eesh. Depending on what that means. So this one, we want to determine the type of observational study used in these scenarios. A study in which balding men were compared with non-balding men at one point in time found that balding men were 70% more likely to have heart disease. This refers to a cross-sectional study. Why is that? That is because of this one point in time. We're not in the past, not in the future, right then and there. The second one, a German study about whether there was an association between mobile phone use and eye cancer, the possible role of radio frequency radiation in the development of uvula melanoma. This one is case control. Why is that? That's because they looked at this in the past, meaning of how people use cell phones, and to see whether or not if they admitted to using a cell phone in a certain fashion, whether or not that could cause eye cancer. So in this case, those particular groups would be based upon what that mobile phone use was they were trying to test. A survey of 1,013 women during 1972 to 1974, so in this case, over 2 years, in which each woman was asked whether she was a smoker. Then, 20 years later, a follow-up survey observed whether each woman was deceased or still alive. This is a cohort study. This was done over the course of 20 years, which meant, it was a long time and it was in the future type of thing to find out what is actually going on with it. Just like observational studies, experiments can also have a type of design, right? So I have three types here. Completely randomized design. Subjects are simply randomly assigned to treatment. This is very similar to that simple random sample. And it's easy to do and not really too doesn't take as much money or time to actually do. Matched pairs design is subjects are matched based on similar characteristics and then compared. One such example is a crossover design, which refers to, usually anyway, refers to pairing with yourself. So pairing each person based on themselves. What does that mean? Something like a pre versus post test. For example, randomized block design, subjects are grouped based on shared characteristics, and then each treatment level is applied within the block. So just showing a couple of examples of those. Example 7. Carol Dweck is a nerd psychologist from Stanford who believes we should praise students' efforts, not their intelligence. In her seminal study in 2006, she gave students a test and then randomly divided the students into two groups. She praised the effort of one group and the intelligence of the other group. For the next exercise, the groups were given a choice of challenging or easy tasks. Of those praised for their effort, 90% chose the challenging task, whereas fewer than half of the students praised for their intelligence chose the challenging task. Why was that? That was in fear of losing their smart status. If you're wondering, she's one of the educational psychologists that specifically have published research with regard to having a growth mindset and whatnot. So usually when referring to, for example, growth mindset and the belief that students are able to learn and grow and be able to change how they learn over the course of time, is based upon her work. Well, she was one of the authors of some work that was published involving it, I should probably say. So if you hear about growth mindset, that's where that comes from. Anyway, we want to identify the treatments for this one. The treatment levels for this are being praised based upon effort or praised based upon intelligence. By the way, this was not the survey that dealt with the growth mindset portion. But that's beside the point. Anyway, what type of experimental design does this employ? Based upon the way this was stated, this would be completely randomized. It would not be matched pairs because she made no effort to actually try to pair students, at least with the way this is written. It was not mentioned about trying to pair students based upon some type of shared characteristic, like for example, background or something like of that nature. Just because she just randomly divided them into two groups, no mention was made if that was actually based on any particular design or not. So this next one. A school psychologist wants to test the effectiveness of a new method of teaching math. She recruits 300 seventh grade students and randomly divides them into two groups. Group 1 is taught by the new method, while Group 2 is taught via traditional methods. The same teacher is assigned to teach both groups. And at the end of the year, an achievement test is administered. Results are compared. So, response variable is going to be the achievement test score. Achievement test score. The explanatory variable that's manipulated is the teaching method. As in this new method versus traditional. Now, experimental design type. This one is a bit different than the last one. Even though it does say here that she randomly divided students into two groups. In order for that to actually have been done, they would have been paired off based upon some type of characteristic like prior knowledge and something like that. So this would actually be a matched pairs, which would then be used for the comparison after the fact, as opposed to comparison of the whole group, comparisons involving the actual pairs. That way it kind of reduces those lurking variables, for example. And then this one. A marketing research firm wants to determine the most effective method for advertising, print, radio, or television. They recruited 300 volunteers to participate in this study. The chief researcher believes that the level of education plays a role in the effectiveness of advertising. So she segments the volunteers by the level of education. 120 have a high school education, 120 have a college diploma, and 60 have advanced degrees. The volunteers in each group are randomly assigned to the print, radio, or television groups, and then after exposure for an hour, a recall exam was administered, and the number of correct answers was recorded and then compared. What type of experimental design does this sound like? Randomized block. What's the response variable? This would be however the effectiveness of advertising was complete in this case, which would be the number of correct answers on this recall exam. The treatment levels are going to be the uh, advertising method. So print, radio, or TV. And what serves as the block? That would be the level of education. So the high school diploma, college diploma, and advanced degrees. And yeah, that's what I have for that. So let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you.